Welcome, everyone. I'm Shep Steiner, Associate Professor of Contemporary Art and Theory at the University of Manitoba and editor of the journal Mosaic. I want to welcome you to the lecture series, Relative Time, Little Time, that the Dutch artist team Bic van der Pol developed in collaboration with the journal. I'll briefly say that Bic van der Pol's special area of practice involves traversing temporal and spatial topologies, archival politics, activating situations, and how dialogue and discourse shape the public sphere. We couldn't have organized this conference without them. Before I thank our sponsors and introduce our speaker, I want to acknowledge the traditional land on which the University of Manitoba campuses are located, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Thank you to our sponsors, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the University of Manitoba Conference Sponsorship Program, and lastly, the Faculty of Arts, the School of Art, and the Institute for the Humanities, all at the University of Manitoba. As for questions to our speaker, please refrain from interjecting until the end of the lecture and realize you will be recorded. Your consent is appreciated. In the chat thread, simply indicate to my co-host Carolyn DeCorno at Carolyn DeCorno or Timothy Brown at Timothy Brown that you have a question, and one of them can unmute you. Carolyn is Mosaic's managing editor and Timothy is our conference assistant. If you can ask your questions with cameras on, that is greatly appreciated. Lastly, I remind you that our next lecture is tomorrow at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time with Dr. Paul Hubener. Now to welcome our invited speaker, Dr. Denise Ferreira Da Silva. She is the director of the Social Justice Institute at the University of British Columbia and both an academic and practicing artist. Her work addresses the ethico-political challenges of the global present, with particular emphasis, I think, on raciality as a temporal predicament. So the question of relative time, little time, is near at hand. I first encountered her very compelling work on violence, value, and Blackness in the film work Infinity Minus Infinity by the Autolith Group. But I think I probably have already said too much because she puts race, colonialism, and contemporary capital in relation and motion in ways that are more complex than I can articulate or summarize using these keywords. Her books include Toward a Global Idea of Race from 2007, A Divide Pagavel from 2019, and Unpayable Debt, which is forthcoming. With Paula Chakravarti, she co-edited Race, Empire, and the Crisis of the Subprime in 2013. She has collaborated on a number of films with Aruna Newman that include Serpent Rain from 2016 and Four Waters Deep Implicancy from 2018. And she has worked with Valentina Desideret on the relational projects Poethical Readings and Sensing Salon. Her presentation today is titled Negative Accumulation. Please welcome Denise Ferreira Da Silva.
Thanks, Shep, for the invitation to be part of this amazing program. And thank you all for being here. I would like to acknowledge that I speak to you today from the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam people, where I have lived and worked for the past 7 years. And I also always like to express my appreciation for their hospitality as we inhabit their lands under settler colonial domination and as they and as we deal with ongoing racial violence. So as Shep said, the title of my presentation today is Negative Accumulation, or That Which Happens Without Time. let me say from the outset that what I am sharing with you today is work in progress. I'll be talking about reflecting on something that I first put in writing a few years ago, but also it also includes some ideas that may never gather in a conventional shape. Fuzzy, I think, is a good descriptor for the approach, and only also because fuzzy is how what I'm attempting to grasp and convey, how it has figured in our thinking all along for a long time. Anyway, so I first used the phrase negative accumulation in the essay titled Unpayable Debt, which was published in 2017 as part of the document 14 Reader. While I do not elaborate on the idea in the book version of Unpayable Debt of the essay, which is, as Shep said, is coming out eventually this year if the paper supply chain normalizes, that book does explicate the phrase further, because in the book I elaborate on the background and also some brings out some details of the larger argument, which is about decolonization. It is about an approach to decolonization as the only appropriate descriptor for the goal, as the goal of any political program that confronts global capital, or that confronts the current shape of the post-Enlightenment version of the liberal, of this liberal juridic form that some of us call state capital. So I'm not going to be talking about decolonization as such as the political project of our times, but it is all over, and this reason why anything that I say, I believe makes any sense, or should have any interest, should be of any interest. Now, when the phrase negative accumulation first came to mind, I was looking for a term to capture what could be described as the trajectory of Black and Indigenous persons and collectives, but also of other former colonized persons and collectives in the past 200 years. What I had in mind back then, or perhaps I should say that that exercise was mobilized by a preoccupation with something that was happening back then in the early 2000s, early 2000s, which is with how those with nothing or blamed for financial losses of those who attempt to profit from their, from their lack of asset. So how is it that Black and migrant persons were blamed, in talking about the US, were blamed for the global economic crisis of 2007, 2008? Negative accumulation was the descriptor that seemed most appropriate when I first thought about today's presentation also. Now, as I present in the midst of yet another global crisis in which Black, Indigenous, and certain migrant persons and collectives from Europe's post-colonies have once again been the worst affected in terms of the disproportional numbers of infections in those populations, numbers of the instances of severe disease and death from COVID-19. Now, I find negative accumulation the most appropriate descriptor because considering the question of time in this context, now I'm thinking here in this early 21st century, is almost impossible if that consideration does not also address what I'm calling negative accumulation, or I'm using negative accumulation as a name for. And a negative accumulation, this contradictory, fuzzy, ambivalent proposition, which suggests several things, but here I'm thinking primarily of a suggestion of a temporal process of the accumulation of something undesirable, bad, pernicious, etc., and then B, of accumulation with a negative value. So the question orienting these reflections today is how to think of accumulation which one considered as an ongoing process may have led or lead to an excess, right, accumulation, how to consider that in terms of deficit as the accumulation of something that has led or may lead to a loss. So the first sense, I think, recalls the global economic crisis of 2007, 2008. Persons and families with lack of assets of equity forced them to take the subprime, so-called subprime loans that were used to make financial instruments which were excessively valuable, so excessively valuable that the whole, the global economy threatened to collapse when those holding these instruments even thought about cashing them. So if in that case, negative accumulation refers to this pernicious accumulation of a pernicious value. So in the second, I think it recalls the case of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. So we find that BIPOC persons and populations are the most likely to contract and experience severe symptoms and die of SARS-CoV-2 infection, precisely because of their physical, pre-existing health conditions and their social conditions, right? Given that whether it's overcrowded housing and the kind of jobs they have in these so-called, but actually truly essential services. So those conditions, physical and the social ones, render them more vulnerable to the disease. So it's undesirable here. What gives accumulation a negative value are the health conditions, high blood pressure, diabetes, and the social conditions, low-paying jobs in transportation, health, and care industries. So what I'll do, and I'll do it very briefly in this presentation, is to consider the question of what makes it possible, something social scientists say all along, but never bother to question, which is that BIPOC persons accumulate deficit. And I think the reason why social scientists don't explain it, because they assume that racial or cultural difference, that is, as a cause of exclusion, discrimination, and oppression, are what causes those conditions, kind of like immediately. I'll say more about that. So I should say that I'm not about to propose another a racial theory. What I'll do is to comment on a few aspects of an analysis of the political that foregrounds how the colonial and the racial have been crucial to the accumulation of capital. That is its very existence, over the past 500 years, but in terms of the racial, over the past 200 years in particular. And this exercise, which is basically speculative, right? I'm just asking what if we thought about this way. This exercise is guided by 3 simple questions. The first 2 are contemplated here, even obviously superficially and briefly, and the third is not. The first one is about time, in particular how racial subjugation, considering racial subjugation in regards to time. And I do so by revisiting how time operates as an economic and an ethic element in Marx's account of capital accumulation, but mostly as an economic element. The second guiding question is about value, and then I return again to the equation of value as presented in chapter 7, volume 1 of Capital. Also, very briefly, I'm not going to quote much. I'm just going to maybe even repeat things I have said before. And then the third and final question, which is the one I don't cover here, but the one I want to mention because it's related to the political significance and urgency of decolonization, which is the whole point of this exercise. It is about the correspondence between violence as applied to extract labor under and land under capital, and the indifference in terms of decisions related to the global, to the COVID-19 pandemic. To those as descriptors, but also in regards to descriptors such as exhaustion, about which I won't say much, but extraction, about which I'll say a bit more. And the ways in which attending to these two, violence and indifference, racial violence and indifference, exhaustion and extraction, allows us not only to appreciate how capital manages to reproduce even under apparently dire circumstances, when everybody's announcing its end, it just comes out back stronger, but also how any proper critique of global capital need to take seriously ecological and racial critiques. Because the excess of the extraction, which cannot return within the acceptable working of things, no, acceptable as that which is in time, of time, and it's measurable, etc., that excess has, among many consequences, both the exhaustion that marks the daily existence of BIPOC populations, as well as the accretion of harmful gases that's causing global warming with the effects we are living now. Obviously, I will not be able to not even think about elaborating the latter connections, but I want to signal how these connections can only become evident when thinking proceeds without the privileging, actually, if thinking proceeds against time. Racial event, or that which happens without time. And I'll open with a quote from Frederick Douglass. I quote, "The slave master's interest in describing the Black man as fit to slavery, discrediting the personality of those he held as property. Every man who had $1,000 invested had 1,000 reasons for painting the Black man as fit only for slavery. The holders of $200 million worth of property in human chattels procured the means of influencing press, pulpit, and politician. And through these instrumentalities, they belittled our virtues and magnified our vices, and have made us odious in the eyes of the world." End quote. Reading Frederick Douglass' The Color Line, it is unavoidable to wonder how is it that so much has and yet nothing seems indeed to have changed in regard to deployments of total violence against Black persons between 1881 and 2021. There is no answer in this question immediately. So when considering deployments of total violence as a political event, the key is to focus not on the specific conditions of deployment, but on the general form under which those deployments of total violence are justified. There's an important distinction I'm signaling here because, which is precisely that between those deployments that are considered criminal, morally and juridically unjustifiable, and those which are deemed necessary, justified as self-protection or self-preservation, or whether juridically, objectively, like different cases of cops that have been acquitted from killing Black and brown persons, or morally, subjectively justified as self-protection, and that may or may not be juridically justifiable too. But what I want to do here is to take Douglas' reading of The Color Line for what it was, I think, an articulation of the term which is very different than how the phrase came to be interpreted in the 20th century, in which it became a descriptor for racial segregation and racial discrimination and exclusion. This is the sense one finds, for instance, in W.E.B. Du Bois's rendering of it in the Philadelphia Negro, and I quote, "In all walks of life, the Negro is liable to meet some objection to his presence or some discourteous treatment, and the ties of friendship or memory seldom are strong enough to hold across the color line," end quote. But that's not necessarily the one we find in Du Bois's later book, one of his later book, Dusk of Dawn, in which I quote, he says, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America, and the islands of the sea," end quote. In that formulation, the emphasis seems to be on relations rather than on the effects or form of the relations, right? Effects, discrimination, segregation, exclusion. This latter emphasis, like on segregation, has been the one accepted and is the one at the core of the explanations for racial subjugation. At the core of what I call the racial dialectic, which places racial difference, physical difference, as the cause for racial differences, social difference, with the explanation that whites, undesirable, no modern, no equal, negative attitudes and sentiments toward BIPOC persons inform their discriminatory exclusionary praxis, which can be individual, collective, or institutional, right? The praxis that keep BIPOC persons in the lower social positions, the lower economic and juridic positions. The racial dialectic explains racial subjugation by attributing it then, or explaining it as an effect of negative ethic moral aspects, and becoming moral and intellectual traits of white persons or social systems, which place Blacks, for instance, in unbecoming social conditions in which they develop the unbecoming moral intellectual traits, or in this case now, this is the explanation for the global economic crisis that was, and then for the global health crisis of today. Presented in terms of systemic causes, right? Institutional systemic racism that make some more likely to die from COVID-19 infection. So their pernicious pre-existing and social conditions are what explain, are an effect of systemic racial discrimination or exclusion. Now, Douglas's rendering of the color line and Du Bois's later rendering of the phrase in Dusk of Dawn do not immediately yield that meaning, that subjugation is an effect of negative personal or societal beliefs, ideas, and praxis. In Douglas' critique of the then late 19th century US prevailing explanation for Black subjugation, he says some other things, such as, for instance, I quote, "Out of the depth of slavery has come this prejudice and this color line," end quote. For him, color line is neither the effect of a natural white mental, moral, intellectual attribute, nor is racial difference expressive of Black persons' mental, moral, intellectual attributes. For him, and he says that explicitly, once those quote unquote undesirable conditions that are coupled with the Black color disappears, there will be no color line drawn. So his description of the color line, in his description of the color line, blackness becomes a condensation of the juridic and the economic components of the colonial political architecture, which had been, which in the case of slave had been lost to slave owners due to emancipation, and that line now becomes associated as blackness. Blackness becomes a correspondence of that juridic economic formation. But anyway, returning to the two senses, to the correspondences to the idea of negative accumulation, it can be said that the latter, if thought as an accumulation of something undesirable, pernicious, meaning negative, would be an effect of the racial dialectic in which racial difference is both the significance of Black and Indigenous persons or collectives' moral intellectual attributes, which whites or the society in general find negative, and also of the effects of these negative beliefs and practices, meaning of the social conditions of subjugation in which they're found. So the racial dialectic as a social scientific explanation for racial subjugation gives the force of necessity as conveyed in scientific universality to those negative social conditions caused by discrimination and segregation. And in doing so, it takes attention away from what Du Bois's second articulation of the color line highlights, in which, the one in which he describes it as a relation, as not necessarily guided by natural racial attributes, but by the 1,000 reasons mentioned by Douglas in his 1881 article on the color line, meaning that economic interest in the juridic form of the slavery and the colony are actually what is at work. Anyway, a crucial effect of the racial dialectic is being to take racial subjugation and with it also colonial domination to take them out of time. As whatever results from natural reactions might be traced to its origins in time, to a beginning of sorts, but it does not belong to time because it does not change. The only change possible would be the elimination of that which generates such reactions. Here we are in the realm of necessity, not liberty, to use Hegel's language of spirit as nature, not as in its shape as history. Now, I do not think that the solution would be to write the racial back in time, not because, or to move the colonial out of the successional time and extend it. Not because, as Douglas also suggests, the reason it functions so well as a way of as a political tool is precisely because it is not of time. Talking about the racial, because it allows for no change, because it refigures necessity, and as such, as a tool for explanation, it also offers an immediate justification for what it describes. However, this does not mean that it is not possible to describe how the racial operates as a mechanism of power in post-enlightenment, in the post-enlightenment political architecture, and as such, how it facilitates capital accumulation as that which allows one to identify the moment of the process of accumulation in which it acquires a negative value. That is the excess that does not count in the calculation of capital precisely because it is not in time. And as such, it is not measurable, though it is definitely included in the exchange value of the commodity. That's possible to do, and I'll go back to that soon. Anyway, when the color line was articulated to figure segregation and Jim Crow in the later 19th century and early 20th century, the common constructions were that it was a badge of inferiority, of slavery or servitude, or the cause of, quoting, a feeling of inferiority. To be sure, both of these meanings were to be central to the arguments for racial equality and the works that belong to what I call the historical version of sociology of race relations. Evidently, because when the color line is presented as a badge or as the cause for a feeling, it fits perfectly in the interpretive moment of the modern episteme and can be reconstructed in psychological, anthropological, or even literary terms. But neither set of disciplinary tools and formulations, however, can capture Douglas' description, because his argument suggests that a process of transformation of the same components had occurred, one in which, in the post-emancipation era, Blackness seems to afford anyone or any institution that's not named, identified, or constructed as Black, it affords the juridical authority to deploy total violence. So that same juridical authority that once was afforded to the owner of slaves and then to white persons during slavery. As such, in my view, Douglas's rendering of the color line is perhaps the earliest announcement of what I call the racial event. That is this analytical tool that, instead of explaining Black and Indigenous subjugation as the fact of unbecoming, negative, but not properly modern ideas and practices, actually describes them as an effect of the proper operations of the liberal political architecture. What this tool allows is to expose how racial violence, both physical, total, and representational, partial violence, is sine qua non for global capital as a condition of possibility for capital accumulation under the hegemonic form of financial capital, but also before of industrial capital and merchant capital. And it does so precisely because it confronts the temporality characteristic of post-Enlightenment thinking, which in liberal and historical materialist accounts, which prevails in liberal and as well as historical materialist accounts of the political. This temporal sequential thinking, as Glenn Coulthard has argued, accounts for for historical materialists is a vow of the significance of the colonial juridic economic architectures, of that which the racial is also a reference. This, as a materialist tool, the racial event displaces temporal thinking, and also its imposition and necessitation of and presumption of separability. And instead, it allows the analysis to move and read back then and over there as constitutive of what happens right now and right here, and as and what is yet to happen, to take the elements of any episode, as well as what has yet to happen. It also allows to take in the elements of any episode of racial violence as prime matter for thinking, and to read what happens. And then at the same time, it takes what happens and what has yet to happen as always a material composition. All is already a moment that is singular, a singular assembling of that which also constitutes what has happened and what is yet to happen. Just a note, because I can't elaborate on it, but it is important to highlight that my thinking of materiality here refers to matter in its quantic and cosmic presentations, as the tiny things that have been entering the composition of everything since the earliest moments of the cosmos, so that which exists always as matter energy, and in this transformation back and forth, as matter energy. Thinking at this level of entanglement demands that we abandon or decenter time, Einstein's fourth dimension. I'm not even talking about Newton's absolute time anymore. But time is still conceived as the arrow of time, which accounts so much for the prevalence of sequential thinking. The racial event describe any moment of occurrence as always already a composition, and necessarily similar to other possible composition. So analytically, when attending to the similar, one necessarily looks for symmetry, that's for correspondences, but by attending to symmetry or looking for similarities, it's possible to recompose the context under observation as a fractal figure. That is, instead of looking for causal, linear connection, compositional thinking, material thinking, seeks to identify patterns, but not patterns as abstract ones, but actually compositions that repeat in different moments and modes of presentation. In the case of the racial event, in the case of the racial event, the pattern in which random racial violence justified because necessary includes a juridic, an economic, an ethic moment. And in it, the racial figures in as the symbolic. Each episode of racial violence includes the ones that happened before, even before the racial came to play, the political symbolic role it's received in the second half of the 19th century. But it performs this operation in its formal and material components. And for this reason, even if separated in space-time, of these instances, of these events are deeply implicated. Each iteration of the racial event explains how racial violence protects property, the juridic economic relationship that joins state capital. Though capital has shifted over the past 500 years or so, the racial recalls an authority that sustains the ethical force of property, the one that authorizes morally and juridically total violence, and an authority which has remained fundamentally the same in all the dominant guises of capital, merchant, industrial, and now in the dominant financial guise. Negative accumulation. Let me quote from Hortense Spillers, because this question is very much guides this exercise. So Spillers ask rhetorically, we might well ask if this phenomenon of marking and branding actually transfers from one generation to another, finding various symbolic substitutions and an efficacy of meanings that repeat the initiating moments. Let me close with comments on two correspondences. Let me start closing this talk with the comments on the two correspondences, the two phrases that spell out negative accumulation. The accumulation of something valued as negative and desirable, the something valued as negative and desirable, and as accumulation of negative value. In the first, which I already deal with elsewhere in the equation of ethical value, which I resolved by breaking up the category of Blackness to expose how the excess, figured as the minus sign, actually also recalls the indeterminate, infinity minus infinity. So what I do not elaborate in that text on the equation of value is precisely how this calculation is working through what Douglas highlights, which is precisely the fourfold image of the political in which economic $1,000, the economic interests met by a juridic modality in the case of slavery would animate symbolic strategy statement that attribute to Blackness vices, not virtues, right? The ethic moment of it. The image of the political here highlights how the four moments operate in tandem in racial subjugation, but in particular how the racial operates effectively because it mobilizes the symbolic force that sustains scientific universality, meaning necessity, and the writing of a social moral subject that does not share in the distinguishing attributes of humanity. That is, it is a component of the modern ethical text, which has ruled in the post-Enlightenment along with humanity, which is the figure that belongs in time and expresses liberty and equality. That got a little garbled. So here the companion is raciality, or the racial, the term that I use to refer to this concept. Obviously, the description of the liberal political architecture does not address the racial in regards to negative accumulation. In particular, it does not break with the thesis of accumulation of the negative, which racial dialectic explains and justifies. Yeah, it doesn't. What it does, however, is to provide the possibility for a critique of the very account of accumulation of capital, and with it, at least one possible way of rewriting the account of accumulation of capital. So let me present some aspects of such reading of global capital by focusing on my second guiding question, the one on value. Here I would like to recall another crucial statement of Marx in Capital, perhaps the most fundamental, which is about how that which creates and recreates capital surplus value is contingent on time. There is no surplus value if part of the social time needed for the production of exchange value is not retained by the capitalist. When considered from this simple vantage point, the centrality of time, both as what delimits capitalism as a particular mode of production that emerges historically, but also as what determines the particularities of capitalist production, the accumulation of capital can be rewritten in such a way as to make it possible to capture how it also includes a negative value. For that to be possible, we need to take into account two renderings of the negative as something that which is not like or the same as something else. So negative as not, and as what is not something else, but it is not, but it's also not something, it's not something else, but it's not anything as a known. Reading Capital, we find slavery and slave labor being mentioned usually in the first sense of the negative as a not. That is, as opposed to free or wage labor, and as such as not counting in the accumulation of capital. That's so, however, because slave labor is not measurable labor. It is not abstract as something that happens in time, not translatable into units, broken into units of time, and then divided, and then calculated in terms of what returns to the worker as wage and what is retained by the capitalist as profit, which can be saved, spent, or returned to the production as capital. This is the case because the first gesture, which is the same in every liberal account of a juridic relation, the agreement, the consent to have the product of one's labor taken by others freely through a juridical agreement, that first gesture the signature of a contract does not take place between the slave owner and the slave laborer. The capitalist appropriates the total value created by slave labor, which is a mode of appropriation that I call expropriation. But capital only appropriate part of that the value created by wage labor, and this is what Marx calls exploitation. So when the analysis of capital attends to both modes of appropriation of value, exploitation and expropriation created by labor, it's so also takes into account slave labor. So it's not ludicrous to demand the return of the total value yielded by slave labor and native lands, which is what I call decolonization, the call for decolonization. Because for one thing, it redefines the economic dimension of racial subjugation. For grounding both juridical, colonial, and symbolic racial violence, the analysis of racial subjugation begins with the acknowledgement that, for instance, emancipated slaves were not only dispossessed of the means of production and of the total value created by their and their ancestors' labor, but that they were also comprehended by a political symbolic arsenal that attributed their economic dispossession to an inherent moral and intellectual defect or deficit. From an economic point of view, it is thus possible to reconsider the post-slavery trajectory of Black folks in the Americas and the Caribbean, for instance, as one of the accumulation of process of economic exclusion and juridical alienation that have left a disproportional, so meaning slavery, segregation, and mass incarceration that have left a disproportionate percentage of them economically dispossessed. So yeah, negative accumulation, otherwise an oxymoron in its first sense, perfectly describes this context. Right? For what slavery as a modality of expropriation has produced is an economic subject which, like the holders of subprime loans, own minus productive capacity, precisely because their ancestors' labor never counted as their property. In that way, that Marx says, those of the wage laborers did. Let me put it in another way. The value equation, purely economic, regardless of the juridical situation of the worker, free or not, is value of means of production plus value of the worker plus value produced by the worker equals the value of the commodity. In slavery, however, the equation is not the same. The value of the means of production plus the value of the worker plus the value of the labor produced by the worker. So, sorry, in the first one, I forgot, it's not the value produced by the worker, but it was surplus value. So anyway, the point is that there is no surplus value or a difference between value produced by labor and the value produced by the worker in the case of slavery. Usually slavery is read as a system of production in which, for juridical reasons, as property, the slave counts as a means of production, as a thing or a tool. Nevertheless, if one assumes that insofar as she is a human being transforming raw materials and other means of production through the expenditure of her vital force into commodities, then the slave labor is living labor, and as such she has productive capacity, and thus she's not a thing. So she should count as a means of production, as a subject of production. Anyway, my point here is that on the positive side of accumulation of money to be turned into capital that is enabled by slavery, there is an excess, which is the surplus value plus wage, that is not registered in the classical historical materialist account of capitalist accumulation. This excess is the value of the worker wage of her labor time, which is retained by the owner, the slave owner. And this transference, it should be noted, is not exhaustive. While the product of one's labor can be appropriated, labor, the productive capacity itself cannot. Now, so the logic of the liberal formulation of labor and property, which is at the core of historical materialism, insofar as it is an intrinsic attribute of human beings, labor itself is not alienable. What the worker sells, for instance, is in the historical materialist account, is not labor power, but labor time. Anyway, the excess retained by the slave owner corresponds to the economic deficit attributed to the descendants of slaves, which I call negative accumulation, or the accumulation of negative things, and which the tools of raciality have transubstantiated into a natural deficit, but which is nothing more than the effect of colonial expropriation and later juridic symbolic violence and ethical indifference. So another way that Marx describes capital accumulation is to highlight how it is contingent upon unpaid labor, but not any unpaid labor, such as, for instance, slave labor or domestic women's labor under marriage, a different kind of agreement. The only labor that is product of capital is contractual labor, that is hired by the capitalist under contract for a limited amount of time. This is the labor that's calculated, that's measurable in time and as time, and which is considered as proper and positive as form and matter that is of capital. And I'm making the case that slave labor as a negative value that is not counted should also be counted. But anyway, let me really conclude now by saying first, in case it's not clear, that both correspondences, both senses of negative accumulation, when they are combined, they add to a closer and I think more adequate description of the accumulation of or reproduction of capital. That is in the sense that profit is first and foremost derived from extraction, from the land as mining and agricultural production or logging of the land, the theft of indigenous lands, as well as extraction of bodies under slavery from the African continent, but also now from other parts of the world. Then and now from other parts of the world, people are forced to leave due to environmental and social catastrophes, as well as the wars of global capital. And of course, of their productive capacity as labor. Those moments of the accumulation of capital can be read through the racial event, which grasps necessarily without time because of how racial difference prefigures the colonial by comprehending the native and the slave as scientific biological tools that write their mental traits without the forms of history and subjectivity. Traditionally, critical racial thinking's response to this effect of the racial has been to present racial matters in terms of connections between back then and right now, the historical ones. So that's not enough. Knowing that Liverpool merchants' profits from the slave trade enabled the emergence of modern banking in Britain in the 17th century does not expose how the racial links these profits and Black insurrections in today's Liverpool, Rio de Janeiro, Minneapolis, or Los Angeles. That is how the economic dispossession and policing animating them is part of the same assemblage that is global capital. For that to be thinkable, we need to be able to imagine and also to take into account what happens without time. Similarly, historical materialism fails to apprehend the racial because in the historical stage, property is figured in time, that is as something that takes a different abstract form in time. Each successive form is contingent upon new social conditions that are separate from the preceding one in time or contemporaneous one in space. Precisely because separability and sequentiality ignore the symmetry highlighted above, historical materialists of today, for instance, ignore the workings of the racial as much as Marx did over a century ago. But when material thinking recalls this symmetry, these correspondences, it fractures it because it creates composition, an image, a complex pattern that distorts the linearity of progress, immediately exposes the global present as composed by each and every iteration of the racial event, and as such, as the accumulation of excess and loss. If what counts and does not count as value, of what counts and does not count as value, as well as of all that is wasted and the noxious effects of incessant extraction that now accumulate on the Earth's troposphere and are bringing about what many say is an already irreversible and deadly planetarian decomposition. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Denise. Fantastic. Denise has agreed to entertain some questions for about 20 minutes. And as I said in the introduction, you're welcome to just say in the chat to Carolyn DeCorno or Timothy Brown that you'd like to ask a question. Let's see if there's any questions first, Denise, before I have a few as well. Has anyone indicated that they would like to ask a question, Carolyn or Timothy?
Not yet.
Okay.
No, not yet.
Maybe I'll just begin with an inquiry then, Denise. Repetition and refiguration and iteration comes up quite a few times in your argument to speak to the problem of negative accumulation. Could you just give us a capsule once again of how how those things are folded into one another?
Yeah, thanks, Shep, for the question. Yeah, you picked up on something that it's central in the presentation, and is also important because it should account and allow for the fuzziness that I want to keep in the presentation as part of the presentation of the argument. Now, those three terms are key precisely to the passage from addressing what happens. Let me stay with the qualified racial. What happens in terms of racial violence or what can be brought under the racial event, moving it from the sequentiality, from that temporality of the unfolding or of the progressive that leaves things behind, to an approach of that, I'm calling it that which happens without time. And without time meaning outside of time in a way, and also at the same time without time because it's so immediate in its, without, in the sense that there is no time in between within the operation, that it all comes up very immediately. And then also without time as a reference to Walter Benjamin's image, right? As that flash, as that which refigures things. And that last, that last way of describing what without time is standing for is precisely what accounts for iteration, repetition, always repetition, iteration. One is a different, every repetition you have a different one, because as the racial event, as an instance of the racial event takes place, that is also a reconfiguration, which I call a redecomposition of the context itself. Property 500 years ago does not have the same meaning as property that property has now, even though it remains a juridic economic form, but it's a different form. And the ways in which it's a different form has a lot to do with how, with the many, many instances of the racial event that has, that have repeated over time. So how to capture something? So it's the question, that came to me again as I was reading Frederick Douglass's The Color Line from 1881. How is it that he's describing precisely what's happening now, right? And how come it is not exactly the same thing? And how do we make sense of this as a political operation, which is what I find his text makes explicit And also, I thought was interesting to see that same term used by him with a completely different meaning as a term would acquire 20 years later when Du Bois first, Du Bois uses it in the souls of Black folk, when it has moved the meaning. Why was it so important that term, the color line, had to be resignified? Because that term, the color line, is what would stand for what they called the Negro problem, and then it was called the race problem, and then in the US eventually became race relations, and then became race as we understand the term. It all goes back to that term, the color line. And in Douglas's iteration, when it appeared, when Douglas is articulating it, then it is specifically about the juridic economic form of property and how slave owners were, still attempting to undermine emancipation, as they did, right? In the last decades of the 19th century. So yeah, so they figured, so going back to your question properly, yes, they figured precisely because they allow me to convey that which is and it's not the same, right? Oh, sorry, I don't know. Okay, I always forget that. And how to take that into account without, also in a way, using such terms throughout the presentation of an argument is, on the one hand, also a way of dealing with the linearity of the presentation that takes place in time and is hopeless. So I do repetition a lot, as much as I can, and I always like pushing to the limit. This one, I think I didn't do much of that repeating, but I do. So in a way, dealing with the linearity of the presentation, because that's it, right? It's unavoidable. But then also at the same time, as a way, as an almost an internal call and response kind of strategy, in which the argument gains by some pieces being brought back up in different moments. So there is a lot of yeah. Anyway, I was going to say I have been playing more and more with the form of presentation as a way of making this academic thing a little less of what it is.
Thank you, Denise. I mean, I was incredibly interested in the analytic that you provide of the color line and its shifting meanings and forms. And if we don't have more questions, I'd love to hear what you think about that. Because I think I hear you privileging Douglas's notion of the color line a little bit more than Du Bois, then, because he has something approximating a negative accumulation, or is that true or not?
No, just Du Bois, the one that everybody likes to talk about, which is Du Bois of the souls of Black folk. Mm-hmm. That is this, preference. Du Bois of the soul. It's like Fanon, that is those who like Fanon of the Wretched and Fanon of Black Skin, White Mask. It's like Du Bois of the soul of Black folk it seems more, I don't want to offend anyone, but it's more familiar than Du Bois of Dusk of Dawn, because that's a communist Du Bois, right? That's a Du Bois more involved and more open and interested in the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist struggles of the 20s and 30s. So on the one hand, yeah, so I like to combine Douglas of 1881 and Du Bois from 1930. Because they are highlighting precisely the juridic economic formation that remains now signified as at the symbolic level, at the level of representation by racial, the concept of the racial and cultural difference. So yes, so it's a way also of making the case that there is no, other possibilities. There is nothing new under the sun, in the sense that all the elements for a critique that actually allows us to really address those many dimensions of global capital, including the colonial and the racial. The elements were there; they have been there for a long time. But the ways in which in the division of labor of different disciplines and political discourses, we have lost it, and then find ourselves fighting for significance, while actually we should combine the different forces and advance a critique that is a critique of capital that is also anti-colonial and anti-racist, and has some significance to the issues we are dealing now regarding global warming. So that's why I went back. I was happy when I found, okay, Douglas can help here.
Thank you. Questions, Carolyn and Timothy?
No one's indicated one to me.
I do. I do have a quick question, if that's possible. I was just wondering if I come from, I'm an artist, and so that's kind of where I kind of enter these conversations. I was just wondering if, in regards to artwork, if time-based media plays an important factor in exploring these new routes away from systems of domination and kind of how to expose them, or if that's just background to the importance of just like proper representation in these spaces.
Timothy, can you give me more like some examples of how you think of a time-based media and how you think it might?
I guess nothing like really specific, just kind of idea of exploring like different modes of art. If that the way we kind of explore art as sort of like paintings and drawings as sort of as static, if kind of exploring new media like time-based media, say Christian Marclay's The Clock, if that helps to create different modes of thinking, or if that's just kind of unrelative to just representation in the gallery space.
Well, I think it depends on on how, right? I mean, if the presentation, if the work is taking advantage, if the work is relying on sequentiality, or on the one hand, like if sequence section is important in the presentation of what the work is trying to bring about, or if the work is still deploying time or using its inherent time aspect to create a certain sense of unity, to keep something like, for instance, the appreciator's position as a unified one that doesn't get lost. That time gives it. If that's the case, then doesn't change anything, right? Because deploying time in this, way in which time has been deployed throughout the last 200 years in the production, in the very production of the subjectivity that it's there in the aesthetic, that gives sense to the aesthetic. So, and by saying that, I'm also saying kind of like all the work we do and the transgressions we do through artworks are also very much confronted by the limits of this hegemonic time, whether it's the sequential time of history or the unifying time of subjectivity, right? That subjectivity has acquired, from the last 100 years of phenomenology, etc. So, but so with Arjuna, we use this time thing, which is a film, and from the first film, we Serpent Rain, for instance, we eventually, I'm not going to tell the whole story of that, but eventually the guiding question for us became, how do we make a film without time and against time? And the film is the tension of trying to do the impossible, right? The whole thing is about trying to do that impossible, including the long shots of the elements during which nothing and lots of things happen, whatever. And the other films kind of face the same challenge by focusing on different things, with this, constrained by by time, because films cannot be without time. So I think anyway, but I think also what's interesting in this whole exercise is not so much to identify a media or a form that is effective, but actually all that can be done as we try with the forms that we have, and then try and create and then come up with other forms. We try against time, confronting time, dissolving the effects of time. I think that's what the interesting things will come out, right? Not getting it right, because that will just become another model, another imposition, another form.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Could I ask you, the film that you mentioned, Serpent Rain, is that situated in Norway?
Yes, so this is the film, that was our first collaboration, and was commissioned by Stefano Harni for the Bergen Assembly in 2016. And the film is about this slave ship that was found off the coast of Denmark back in the 70s, and then it became an evidence that Norway was involved in slave trafficking. So that's, and the film also being this installation, The Shipping and the Shipped. And yes, and so basically it was about, just talking about slavery, and pretty much, I mean, some of what I said here is in the film, but then it just became more than a critique. And then also, instead of Arjuna doing a film about me, we kind of collaborated in when the questioning of time, when we brought the questioning of time to the form, then it became a collaboration. Because the questioning informed the kind of film that Serpent Rain became.
Thank you. Could I ask you, about negative accumulation, if it's inversely or asymmetrically related to the kind of, massive surpluses and excesses of capital that we see today? Is there some kind of asymmetrical relationship there that you're posing in spite of symmetries and getting around symmetries, or not? Is that a kind of symmetry that exists beyond asymmetry that is posed?
I think that's, let's say, a kind of the symmetry that exists in the symmetry, only because what is extracted to become part of profit has been translated into a deficit that is not of the economic order. That is the explanation for racial subjugation, or for post-colonial subjugation in general, including talking about countries. It has shifted what was the effect, what should have been, what should have been described as an effect of juridic economic expropriation, of a juridic economic relation, became an effect of a moral deficit, and out of the economic, out of the equation, right? So, but that is an excess in profit that corresponds to what has been translated out, right? So this is why when bringing that which is being translated out or transubstantiated, the term I use, it is the bringing it out and exposing it within that that is the hope of exploding it. Kind of like in the same way that excess of extraction is undermining the planet itself, right? I mean, we can think of this accumulation up there in the troposphere as precisely that. That is too much in capital accumulation that is not accounted for, and it's usually, but it is either spent or reinvested in the accumulation of capital. But it doesn't go anywhere. It's like everything else, that exists. This thing is transformed, transduced into something else, and it explodes. So that's why that's the play with negative accumulation. So in chapter 24, I think it's chapter 24 of volume 1, Capital, Marx is about the one of the two on the process of accumulation of capital, the first one on the process of accumulation of capital. And then Marx has this phrase about, the absolute zero of exploitation, labor exploitation, would be a situation in which the capitalist does not pay a wage, right? So there is no wage going to the reproduction of labor. So I'm also playing with that. That's the absolute zero. I mean, if such a thing is possible, yeah, okay, you can, that is a zero in math. And then there is the negative values, right? Anything else, so if the difference between, the crucial difference between slave labor and wage labor is the contract, and that's why slave labor doesn't count. If you eliminate that juridical distinction, slave labor is what's there as part of the negative value that it is entering capital accumulation. But it's negative value defined through this zero, which is wage laborer who does not receive a wage. Okay, so that's another way. I was going to play with this one, but then that would have required creating another crazy equation, and I didn't want to do it for you, but but it's going to come up in another one. So this is another way of figuring it, but it's only, so the whole point of, so the negative, can show up in these ways, right? The accumulation of negative things, which is the deficit, right? That raciality explains away the expropriation, the moment of expropriation that is crucial for the accumulation of capital, and the accumulation of something that has a negative value. So that is the one of the absolute zero, being the wage laborer without a wage, who is not a slave, right? He doesn't call it slavery. Slavery is something else because slavery is a different juridic relation. So if there is a contract, a free agreement, involving two or more people, that is what counts for capital. So for slavery, even a negative value, even for including negative values as the values coming from slavery and also from colonial domination, then of course you have to eliminate that juridical distinction, which is something I do in unpayable debt. So I play with that and eliminate the distinction and explore that.
Right. I'm reminded of the place of the zero in Gayatri Spivak's reading of Demand, actually. And so it becomes an allegorical question, the zero. Is that true?
Yes, primarily. It becomes, so the zero, because it's also a lot about the erasure of certain distinctions between, you take an equation, and one of the things that I play with or I experiment with is to treat an equation as a statement, right? And the resolution of the equation The equation itself is a statement, and the resolution of the equation is a way of looking at how the statements put together, or how to, redecompose the statement, and not treat it as an equation. But at the same time, because it is an equation, it's always possible to play with the two at the same time, with the calculation that gives you value in this mathematical way, but also with the statement that in a way gives you an explanation for why something has the value of 0 or has a negative value in that. And the same in different texts, I have played with equations to do both. And in that sense, the 0 can become allegorical too, and can.
Right, thank you. When you emphasize statement, do we detect a little Foucault or Deleuzian reading of Foucault in there or not?
Only if it is a violation of both of them. Now, you see, the Deleuzian reading of Foucault is interesting statement, because I was proud when I was a grad student back in Brazil. I was proud of being in the Foucauldian side of things, not the Deleuzians, because the Deleuzians had no commitment to anything political, my generation used to say. And I remember not long ago, I was presenting at the Sense Lab, and I don't know if it was because of Aaron and Brian that I'm talking like, oh, I'm sounding so Deleuzian that the younger me would hate this thing. So yes, it's something. I think it's how do I say this? The usage of statement in this context has to do with being a member of a generation, and having had yes, I think through reading, studying, thinking with Spivak and Hortense Spillers and others, thinking through with an outside and trying to go beyond beyond post-structuralism. I'm a child of post-structuralism who is struggling from within, confronting it. And in the process, maybe going to one camp and not the other, and whatever. That was a funny one. Yes, a Deleuzian reading of Foucault. Yeah.
Nice to hear. Thank you. Carolyn, Timothy, is there one last question?
We just have comments thanking Denise for. Would you want me to read them, or would you just want Denise to look at them after?
Yeah, well, I can look at. I'm looking at them now. I'm not going to read them, but thank you, Wendelin and Melanie, for the comments.
Great. Denise, thank you for your time. It's been wonderful, and we really appreciate your entertaining our questions after your fantastic talk. Thank you.
No, thanks, Shep, for the questions, and Timothy, and thank you, folks, for staying around. Thank you for the invitation again. Bye.
All right. Thank you very much.
Great day.